Feel free to get cozy. I think we're going to be an intimate group tonight. No? Background sitters? Okay, that's fine. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Michelle. More importantly, this is Wilbur, for any of you who don't know. I just joined JetBrains' team about 3 weeks ago. Woo! And I also serve as a technical advisor to the Center for Practical Bioethics, Ethical AI Council, Microsoft MVP, and I did my Master's of AI at Johns Hopkins. Are you situated now? Okay. So what are we here to talk about today? We're talking about AI, yes, but we're going to take a kind of a different approach to it. We want to talk about where we've come from, where we are today, and how do we go forward. Hang tight. New computer problems. So, Martin Luther King Jr., we are not makers of history, we are made by history. In order to move forward, we have to pause. We need to evaluate where are we today, but also how do we get here? What happened along the path? In AI, we can honestly trace its beginnings back to ancient myths, to ancient Greece, to mythology. And we can weave these schools of thoughts throughout several fields, which is what we're going to do today, so that we can kind of understand how these different types of thinking have led to our current school of thought. And then we can pause and say, are we getting it right? Do we need to change anything before we go forward, before we go forward too far? So our agenda, this is actually going to change. I'm going to flip this, as about an hour ago I decided to do this, because why not? So our story time is going to come out. We're going to talk about something else, but we'll squeeze it in there just a little bit for time. Most importantly, we're going to flip back and forth between 2 and 3. We want to look at historical context of different fields while also evaluating different types of themes that are emerging from these thoughts. And something that I'm going to call out is that we could spend an entire day looking at different examples from each of these schools of thought. So I pick out 3 of each, but know for every 3, there's at least a dozen more that would be just as appropriate to bring up. 4, we're going to look at modern-ish metrics. So how have we evaluated AI? What are we proposing currently? And where do these fall short? Which leads us into asking the question, what is intelligence? What is artificial intelligence? And how do we think about it in the broader scope of the world? It's not just a technology, right? It weaves with our lives. So what we really need to do is take a socio-technical perspective. And then how do we go forward? So AI is fun because we keep trying to make statements in a field that is changing. And it's not just about the technology, though we're going to talk about that too. It's also about the landscape that it operates in, right? Because AI is one of those really interesting fields in that it's so tightly woven with who we are as humans, with our human story, right? But also, it has an ecosystem. There's a political ecosystem. There's an economic ecosystem. There's different types of regulations that vary across borders when we have a technology that doesn't exactly have borders. And we have a very heated political environment. I obviously am coming from the States, Kansas City, Missouri, to be exact. And I left when President Biden was in office. And when I fly home this weekend, Trump will be president, or is president. And on Inauguration Day, which coincidentally was on Martin Luther King Day, a holiday that we celebrate in the States, one of the very first things that Trump did was repealed, or rather put on hold, 50 different executive orders of the Biden administration. And these were all flagged for review, one of which was Biden's AI executive order. The very next day, I believe there was a specifically new order stating that AI should be free from social agenda and that no types of bias should block innovation. And then Stargate was announced to have $500 billion invested in it. And Stargate, for reference, is a project that is 40% owned by OpenAI, 40% by SoftBank. Who can tell me what happened this week? DeepSeek. Yeah. Stock markets are going wild this week. I got some news, I think, on Monday. And transparently, I've been traveling the last couple of weeks, so I haven't been able to dig into the paper from DeepSeek to entirely see kind of what has changed. But we have a new model on the market. It's from China. It's open sourced. It is reportedly much cheaper. So I think the reportings was that their first model cost about $5.5 million. We can estimate that this one that's being released is a little bit more. But even if we say that that's maybe $10 million to train, that's still a significant change from what we've seen so far with transformers. And in a lot of ways, this could be wonderful. It could democratize the ability to create large language and foundation models for companies that haven't had the resources that other tech companies have had. So it remains to be seen. Now, there's also a lot of political context happening here. In that, again, this just came out of China. The US is also looking at banning TikTok already because we're afraid that user information is going to be leaked. This is going to operate just the same in DeepSeek. So what happens remains to be seen. This is kind of an unfolding story, and whenever this gets on YouTube, we're going to have more answers. But for right now, this is what we have today. And I think it's really important to call that out because this is changing, right? This is an evolving ecosystem and an evolving landscape. It is not new. It's as old as we are. So what I was going to start out with was a few excerpts from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Who has read the book? Maybe some time? Does anyone volunteer to give me a very quick summary of maybe just the first little bit of Frankenstein?
You're talking about the pre-story where Mary Shelley...
No, like the first few chapters. So the monsters, maybe creation and a journey and Frankenstein's interaction with it.
He was lonely, he wanted to advance science. He figured out that he could maybe take dead pieces and make light from them.
Yeah.
He didn't think about what was going to happen next.
Exactly. He didn't think about it. So a couple excerpts that I was going to walk us through come from chapters 4, 5, 10, 11, and 13. You can really, if you wanted to reread the book, you could just read the first 15 chapters, and it will illuminate a lot of what's going on right now. But we can see themes, right? There's this insistence on creating the monster. Frankenstein isn't sleeping. He says that he's sick, he's ill, his family is worried about him, and yet he must persist. He's just driven to madness to create this creature. And then the monster is born, and Frankenstein gets afraid, he abandons him, and then the creature has to kind of go on this journey. And he starts interacting with society who's afraid of him. He doesn't understand why they're afraid of him. He doesn't understand the sensation on his body. And then he finds out, oh, it's cold. I need clothing. I need shelter. I need food. I have all these different functions in my anatomy that I just don't understand. And my creator has disappeared. And then eventually there's a confrontation. And yes, the monster threatens to kill Frankenstein, but first he also pleads with him, and he says, can you explain to me why this has been done? And in chapter 13, he says, and what was I? Of my creation and my creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. And if we were to read this whole thing together and maybe do some deep thinking about it, we could come up with some observed themes. And again, this is from the 1800s, right? We're thinking about what would it mean to create a machine like us? And throughout the story, we see these themes of obsession and ambition, of Dr. Frankenstein's relentless pursuit of creating this monster. And along with that, creation and responsibility, the creature's lament about being abandoned by its creator. What are our responsibilities as developers, as technologists? Where is our accountability for what we create? And unintended consequences, Victor's horror at what he had created, his wanting to put Pandora back in the box and his inability to do so, the learning and adaptation of the creature, as he has no information about his container, about how he works, and he meanders through and eventually, meets other people, that societal integration and impact. How does this technology, if we think about him like that, interact with and respond to the world? And in all of this, what's the ethical implications of this creation, of moving forward for obsession and ambition and wanting to find out what's on the other side without maybe the guardrails and understanding how we get from A to B? So I said we were going to go back. And I meant all the way back. So again, these are going to be a couple different schools of thought, right? And there are so many examples, I want to emphasize that, in each of these different sections. But we're going to look at 3. So perhaps the first story of an artificial human-like creation was the story of Talos. So this originated around the time of Homer, so about 750 BC. And Talos was a giant bronze man commissioned by Hephaestus, or created by Hephaestus, commissioned by Zeus to guard the island of Crete. And I believe he patrolled the island 3 times, kept the inhabitants safe, everyone was happy. So we're already seeing, again, 750 BC, these stories and ponderings of a creature or machine like us that protects us, right? Who has seen My Fair Lady? Read the play or any of the, okay. So that is based off of the story of Pygmalion and Galatea, right? So Pygmalion was a sculptor who fell in love with the statue that he carved, and he wished for her to be alive. So Aphrodite granted this wish, and the statue Galatea was brought to life. So again, we're seeing themes of creation, of desire, of the transformation of inanimate objects into living beings. And then in Jewish folklore, we have the Golem of Prague, which was a clay creation that was brought to life by a rabbi to protect the Jewish community from persecution. It was animated using mystical rituals, and at the end of the story, I believe it killed everyone. It became uncontrollable. So again, we have this both desire to go forward, but then there's this fear too of what does it mean? Where can it go wrong? Does it become more powerful than us? Will it be used for good, or is it the end of humanity? So we can start to ask ourselves questions. And in this case, maybe it's, what do these ancient myths tell us about humanity's desire to create lifelike beings? What responsibilities do they imply for creators? Around the same time, we can look at some ancient philosophy. From the stories and teachings of Socrates, he emphasized the importance of self-knowledge as essential for making right decisions and leading a virtuous life. So concepts of introspection and self-awareness, right? In order to improve and make right decisions, you must first know your own character. And then Aristotle and Euclid began ideas that physical systems could operate as a set of logical rules, and maybe human thinking could then be a symbolic system. Euclid, father of geometry, developed the first algorithm for creating the greatest common divisor. And we can start kind of making some parallel questions. Is the body a complex machine? Is the mind a complex machine? Is there a divine algorithm? What is the connection between the physical realm and our minds? And if thinking can be represented by symbolic systems, are humans just complex machines? What are we? So we move into early modern philosophy, and we see a lot of the same similarities, right? So Thomas Hobbes viewed reasoning as a form of computation, equating human thought processes with mathematical operations, and that cognitive processes may one day be replicated by machines. René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, from Meditations on First Philosophy. So how do we know for certain that what we perceive is real? How could we verify our own consciousness? What sort of tests would we need to prove that our thoughts are ours and ours alone, and that the world around us is real? And Descartes also argued in other writings that if we were ever able to mimic a human as a machine, it would never pass as real because it would lack a mind and therefore a soul. And then we also have the German mathematician Leibniz. Please forgive my American pronunciation. And he's going to come back into our story in and out, but he argued that the human soul is itself programmed, and that the mind is a container and the body is simply a complex machine, but it is one with a set of divine instructions. So could machines ever possess true understanding and consciousness? What differentiates us from machines? And possibly my favorite subject is automata. And again, there are so many examples, but one of the earliest came out of 1560, Spanish clockmaker Juanelo Tirriano. I believe this was commissioned as a gift for King Philip II of Spain, whose son had been sick and then miraculously recovered, and he wanted to present him with a gift. So he created this monk out of moving clock parts, and the monk could walk, or I think it rolled across the desk. It beat its chest in contrition, moved its lips in prayer. It held like a rosary or crucifix that went up and down. And the monks and everyone at the time was like, what the hell is this? Go forward just a little bit. Does anyone know the phrase, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck? So where that originated from is twofold. The first instance is actually in 1739. Jacques de Vaucanson created a digesting duck. So this was a bronze duck that was constructed of about 400 moving parts. It had little pellets that it eventually shit out and walked across the table. And again, people said, what the hell is this? What's the difference between this thing and a duck? If it has the functionality of a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it moves like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, I don't believe it did, is it a duck? Now, I have to also give the side note that that phrase was actually popularized in the 60s when they were talking about communists in America, but originally Jacques de Vaucanson, so we should pull that back to its creation. And then, of course, perhaps the most popular was the Mechanical Turk. So this marveled crowds across Europe. It played chess and beat some of the best chess players in Europe at the time. Shortly thereafter, it was revealed to be a hoax. So there was a Wizard of Oz man behind the screen pulling the chords. But still, we started getting this fascination of mimicking behaviors of living creatures, of mimicking ourselves, of different tasks that we can do, of different games that we can play, of bettering ourselves, of besting ourselves, and asking, well, if we can make a machine that does this, what are we? And if we could build machines that mimic aspects of human behavior, could we build a machine that would one day replicate humanity? So I have to, of course, call out just a few mathematical and computer science breakthroughs. I'm going to gloss over these. We're all technologists. We know this list is a mile long, but a few that would be worth looking at. Enter again our friend Leibniz. The step reckoner was an early calculator of sorts. It worked kind of similar to a billiards table where it had canals and poles and sticks, and it used basically a binary system. And then Babbage and Lovelace in 1837, he designed the analytical engine, which is often considered the first general purpose computer. Wasn't completed in his lifetime, but again, the designs were there. Featured control units, memory, I/O devices, and our first programmer, Ada Lovelace in the footnotes came up with the first algorithm. So we can start asking, do these early mathematical innovations suggest that human cognition could be mechanized? Or are there aspects of human thought that still remain beyond the reach of machines? Intercomputer science breakthroughs. So our granddaddy Turing comes in with the universal Turing machine. Of course, we have Boolean logic and the stored computer concept, stored program concept, von Neumann. This list, again, is a mile long, but you can kind of start seeing these different fields, right, of early modern philosophy saying, what does it mean to be human? How would we prove our own existence? How would we prove our usefulness? The arts as well. I didn't even bring up the arts, but there's also this investigation through those threads as well. And then we actually have the engineers that are making the work happen, that are trying to advance. So we have theoretical foundations, right? And they're laid. But do they fully capture the complexity of our intelligence and consciousness? What else is happening? We have the rest of the world, public perception. So remember, we call those machines automata. We didn't have the word robots yet. That came out in a play, Rossum's Universal Robots, from 1920. At the end of the story is the robots took over and killed everyone. Sound familiar? Yeah, why not? Yeah. Basically, it's the plot of just about every robot movie. Get original. Who had any sort of computer science classes and were taught the 3 laws of robotics, Isaac Asimov's? Does anyone want to call out the fact that he was a science fiction writer? So, science fiction writer, and he was responding to this public fear of machines that were starting to mimic humans, of Rossum's Universal Robots, of wondering if machines were going to take over. And the 3 laws of robotics were basically, a robot must not harm a human or allow a human to come into harm. It must obey a human. It must protect its own existence. And there's always caveats, right? It can't interfere with the rule prior. It can't interfere with the rule prior to that. And then eventually there was an add-on, Rule 0, that was like, don't kill humanity. Simple enough, right? But is it relevant? And is it making our trajectory and our measurements and our rules not quite valid to what we have? I recently got a comment on LinkedIn, outing this person, sorry, that responded to I posted an article about Trump pulling back regulation, and this person basically stated, yeah, well, they didn't even add in the 3 laws of robotics, and went on to validate. Oh, that's fun. There we go. So this has stayed, right? And then, of course, our favorite Space Odyssey, HAL 9000, right? This very calm, methodical voice. And again, what happens? So we're starting to build this fear up in the 20s, in the 40s, in the 60s. So how have science fiction and popular culture shaped our expectations as well as our fears of AI? So in the 1949 London Times, Turing was quoted by saying, "I do not see why machines should not enter any of the fields normally covered by man. I do not even think that you would draw the line about sonnets, though the comparison is perhaps a bit unfair because a sonnet written by a machine will only be better appreciated by another machine." Sound familiar, ChatGPT? And then in 1959, he came up with the imitation game, the Turing Test, which is we have an interviewer, which is human, we have a machine, and we have another human. And the latter two are off in a room, and then you have the interviewer. The interviewer is trying to decipher which of these entities is a human. The human is trying to collaborate, without revealing any clues, and then the machine is also trying to trick the human into thinking that it is human. And for a long time, we were using this as a benchmark to say, did we get it? Have we tricked the human into thinking that we have another human? Can machines think was the title of this paper. Can they? Or is it really just the imitation game? So Turing passed away, right? But individuals wanted to carry on with his work. And in 1956, we had the Dartmouth conference with the founding fathers of AI who coined the term artificial intelligence in 1956. And at the end of the workshop, they basically came up with 3 outcomes. AI would be theorized and advanced by big tech and academics working together. It was going to require a lot of money, so it should be commercialized and acquired through the military. And it was going to require a network of interdisciplinary researchers, because we understood at the time, at least, that this wasn't just about computers, it wasn't just about technology, it was about all these different fields coming together. Do we notice anything about these founding fathers? Other than the fact that, yeah, not a lot of diversity outside of perhaps fields, right? So can we?
Some wear glasses and some of them don't.
Yeah, there's, some have worse vision than others. Ray needs a haircut.
Some don't need a haircut
Needed.
anymore.
So here we are trying to capture the intricacies of what it means to be human. But we're not even capturing the whole spectrum of experience. And how did these foundational goals that were set during the workshop shape the direction of AI research? Are they still relevant today? Well, people were excited, right? We had science fiction that was telling stories about robots are going to kill the world. There was advanced promises made about beating chess within a few years. Those things didn't happen. So we had the AI winter, which was basically a lack of funding. Machine learning started getting advanced in the 80s. There's a whole other school of history that is happening right around this time from 1956 to modern. But let's look at just a couple milestones in AI. So in 1997, IBM's Deep Blue made headlines because it defeated the reigning world chess champion. In 2016, AlphaGo beat the world's best Go player, which also kicked off interest in China at becoming the world's best AI creations too. So what we talked about a little bit earlier today, we can trace back some origins here as well. And then of course ChatGPT, OpenAI 2022. But what's the common thread here? Why were these hailed as successes? Because they beat us. They tricked us into thinking they can write the emails better than us, right? They beat the world's best Go player. It beats the world's best chess player. And from a technology standpoint, that's absolutely fantastic, right? But why are these the things that we praise? So as we move forward, we have to start asking, should we be defining AI success by human failure? Should we be defining AI success by human replication? This is the point where we make a choice. Do we continue down this path, or do we say, maybe we keep advancing the technology, but understand other types of benchmarks? So how are we measuring things? Modern-ish metrics. These are different metrics that have been proposed within the last 10 years or so. Obviously, things have been turned on their head recently. We'll talk about that soon. But just kind of quickly to help you understand the different types of things that have been measured. So the Marcus test assesses an AI's capability to interpret complex multimedia context without textual support. So it tries to measure nuances like sarcasm, for example. But as humans, we often get that wrong too, right? Especially when we introduce cross-cultural understanding, language nuances. How can we successfully measure this in a machine? The visual Turing test basically, it's like the Turing test except with visual stimuli, and there's not much that can be said about this. We know how computer vision is performing. Interestingly, though, we learned last week a metric that human brains now process images within 13 milliseconds. So we're evolving too. The Lovelace 2.0 test is actually kind of interesting. It tries to measure creativity. It tries to measure novel ideas. But how can we truly measure that? I could go paint a photo, paint a picture, maybe write a dream or something kind of wacky, and the novelness, the uniqueness of this would be still subject to interpretation by other humans, right? It'd be really hard to create some sort of a benchmark to measure something novel, unless perhaps you're DALL-E. And the reverse Turing test basically flips the others on its head. So you want to deceive the AI system into thinking that a human interaction is a machine-generated response, which it's interesting, right? But it doesn't really adapt to nuanced human input, and it's really more of an interpreted tool than it is a direct measurement. And then there was a challenge, the Winograd Schema Challenge, which focused on resolving ambiguity in language processing. So it measured the linguistic precision and contextual interpretation, but it was pretty narrow focused on language. In 2019, Francois Chalais wrote a paper that was trying to ask, what is intelligence? And eventually, he proposed ArcAGI. This is an ongoing challenge right now with results that I screenshotted from today of how the different models are performing. They're not awesome. We're still not quite there yet. And there is a cash prize, if anybody wants to go research this. There's been quite a bit of papers that have been put out recently trying to score very high in this challenge. And the benchmarks basically consist of these grid puzzles where it shows a pattern, and then the machine, the algorithm, must come up with the rest of the pattern. Okay, so it's responding to novel output with trying to generalize over memorize, but that still doesn't quite capture the complexity, right? If we were to say, how do we measure intelligence? Another paper from last year, the benchmark of massive multidiscipline multimodal understanding benchmark. It's a mouthful. Yeah, so it's an interesting test that basically tries to evaluate for college-level reasoning across different texts and images with interdisciplinary fields. So the disciplines they list were about 26% engineering, 23% science, art and design 11%, business 14%, humanities and social science 9%, medicine about 17%. So that's starting to get interesting, right? But what are we missing? What's intelligence? If I were to ask you to define intelligence for me, in a human, shoot out some themes, some ideas.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for you?
Why would I answer the question?
Well, if you show up to the dinner, I'll buy you a beer later.
But AI doesn't do that.
Yeah,
AI just follows orders. It never says, hang on.
okay.
So,
So is that, would you say, autonomous behavior, decision making, intrinsic motivation?
intrinsic motivation.
Okay.
The ability to score high on an intelligence test.
What's an intelligence test? If you look at this, yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of ableism in this field too.
Yep.
If you look at the states, you look at different types of standardized testing that's done on children, we miss the mark in a lot of different aspects, and there's a lot of people that are left behind. What else?
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness,
Problem solving.
problem solving.
Looking at how to be happy in the world.
How to be happy? Yeah. Why are we still here? Purpose?
Comprehension and adaptation to change.
Yeah. Adaptation and comprehension. We could make a very long list. And this is not complete, but we can start kind of grouping these ideas together into different themes, right? learning and adaptation, sensory processing and multimodal integration, right? We don't just take in the world from one sense. Now, we start getting into dangers of ableism here too, right? Because not everybody has the same level of senses that others do. What's our cognitive architecture and processing look like? The way that your brain is structured, how it takes in input from visual and auditory and conceptual understanding from experiencing the world around you. You know, ChatGPT could tell you that in Kansas City in September, the crisp, cool air might make you want a sweater, but it doesn't know the feeling of a sweater. It might not be able to differentiate between a soft sweater and a scratchy one. Language and communication. What are the nuances of how we communicate with each other? It's not always just, through words, right? It's how we interact. It's how we perceive body language. It's eye contact and sometimes the vibe that we give each other. How do you measure that? Creativity and autonomy. Empathy and ethical thinking. I'm not going to read all this for you, but this was an exercise I did a couple of years ago trying to figure out what's intelligence, right? What sits on the human side and what sits on the machine side and what do we share and what do these concepts kind of bubble up to and where are there opportunities and where are there challenges? What do we have the technology to try and measure, try and replicate, and what are we still missing? So there might be an opportunity here to say, okay, what are different ways of creating measurement, right? How could we take these maybe more broad categories and think of indicators for each piece and say, for empathy and ethical thinking, is there social intelligence? How would we measure that? How would we create a test to measure social intelligence? How would we create a test to measure moral reasoning? How would we create a test to measure curiosity, right? For making decisions in novel environments, for generalizing what we've learned into new environments, into new experiences, for creating lifelong and continuous learning. There's a lot that we're missing, right? So this is the part where I tell you I don't have an answer for you. We love these, don't we?
Yes.
There is no answer because it's still evolving. But also, if you went up to a neuroscientist and you said, define intelligence in a human for me, most of them would tell you they can't fully. They can say that a brain is the machine that is closest to us, that we carry with us every day, all day, and yet it's perhaps the biggest mystery in our world. So how can we truly say that we understand it, that we've replicated it, that we've defeated it, if it still is hiding things from us? And is that a mystery that we want to unlock in the way that we're currently unlocking? So AI is here, it's not going anywhere. What do we do about it? Well, I mentioned this earlier. This is a socio-technical problem. What does that mean? You know what, I'm not gonna answer that. Tell me what that means to you. Someone give me some responses here.
Interaction between
Mm-hmm.
people and technology.
Yeah, interaction between people and technology.
Technology facilitates new ways for people to interact.
Yeah, technology gives us new, novel ways to interact with ourselves.
Technology is not neutral and separate from society.
Technology is not neutral and separate from society. It doesn't operate in a vacuum, does it? So it's not just tech, right? We're building systems that are deeply woven into how we operate, into what it means to be a human, into our systems that have systemic issues, that have violence, that have bias in them. And there's cultural considerations too, right? they're not operating in isolation. They're deeply embedded between broader social and ethical and technical systems. And then we're deploying and developing these things without always considering that there's a greater perspective here. Harmful bias versus fairness. I'll give a workshop tomorrow on how do we think about bias in machine learning? How do we measure bias, right? What are the different methods right now for mitigating, measuring, and managing bias? It's a real thing. Humans are biased. I'll give you a brief story. Last week, some of you will chuckle, I was dealing with an issue with Lufthansa. And I have a service dog behind me. I have epilepsy, and he helps me when my brain decides to shut itself off and on again. And he's got about as much paperwork as an American service dog can get. And Lufthansa, in their defense, has one of the highest rates of service dog bites on airplanes. I went back and forth with them for 7 days in which I couldn't get a clear answer in what else I could provide to them further than the 13 documents and letters from trainers that I had already provided them. I would wager a guess that there was someone with a bias on the other end of that. In that case, I would have loved to have interfaced with a checkbox that was a system that said, do they meet the requirements? And as British Airways found out within 6 hours, yes, I did. So what's that collaboration, though? Because if we get that wrong, if we get that checklist wrong, right, then we're just going to amplify already existing systems of bias. So how do we make the human-AI collaboration? And of course, is AI going to take my job? What's the impact on employment and on society? Forecasting is a really tough spot to be in right now, and I'm not envious of the people that are trying to do it. But also, we've looked at AI throughout history, right? We've seen all these instances where we've asked ourselves what it means to be human, along with advancements being made. Each of those advancements brought change. We adapted. New jobs were created. Other jobs were replaced, maybe even jobs that nobody really, wanted to do. Maybe they did. But we moved forward. We're going to keep moving forward. I can't tell you what tomorrow looks like, but I can tell you that we're going to get there. Responsible development. Big conversations happening right now on climate impact, on how much energy and water usage it takes to run all these different models. Look at what's been happening in LA. The wildfires, I think last I looked, were over 50,000 acres. For context, the island of Manhattan is about 22,000 acres. Now, there are some people that are trying to draw parallel lines between these two things. I wouldn't draw a strong line, but I would say we have to look at our energy consumption, how our systems are built. DeepSeek, if the reports are true, that might be interesting from a climate and energy perspective. But then also, have we left behind the interdisciplinary approach? We as technologists, as engineers, are not always great in other use cases, right? We know how to abstract the business language that has been given to us to make deterministic choices. This isn't that. We need lawyers involved, right? We need to understand, when has this shit gone wrong with just humans? We need healthcare professionals. We need so many more people than just the engineers saying, did it work? Check, move on. So how do we move forward? Well, first we got to figure out what our trajectory risks are, right? We've got to look at the things like our climate impact, our footprint. We have to look at bias and how it has already been hurting systems for much longer than just the past few years. Since machine learning, honestly, was introduced, we've had an amplification of human bias. And what happens? Those outputs become data that feeds back into the system that we're measuring. Cyclical. We have to think about how we measure AI success. How do we as a society or as technologists decide when we have done something good? What do we praise? What do we say, maybe we don't need to tackle that thing? What if we applied it over here instead? What if we augmented a behavior? What if we made it easier? What if we gave ourselves purpose in this category because we've alleviated the stress over here? Inclusive evaluation metrics. As an individual with a neurodiverse brain, I don't always love when screens flash at me. Sometimes it does some fun stuff. And oftentimes that's not thought about. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a website and gone, woo, not that one. And there's a lot of accessibility in web design, but what about accessibility in AI? Where are we missing the mark because we're not considering that the perfect human doesn't exist? And how do we make human-centric AI design? I will always praise NIST. They've done a fabulous job of creating different frameworks for balancing human-focused AI design. And interdisciplinary research integration, just like we talked about. Policy and regulation. What are the risks of operating in a deregulated environment? Well, what you're going to see is different companies that come forward and say, these are our standards. This is how we have aligned our company values with our industry values, with the government values, and how we think our customers want us to behave. And this is the roadmap that we've created. Well, what that's going to lead to is a patchwork quilt of different types of standards that change as we move across things, and inconsistency for our users too. This is an interesting time, I think, in the next few years, because it's going to be up to corporations to decide, do you develop towards the bottom line of not losing customers, or do you innovate to attract public trust, to attract new customers? Last thing I will add, as I always add, is that I'm not a doomsday AI person. I sound a little bit sometimes, but I consider myself a pragmatic optimist. And what I mean by that is that I love the potential of this field. I love the potential of this technology to make our lives better, to make the world more inclusive, to make it easier for different people that have a harder time, to make fun, life again, to give purpose, to bring happiness, right? I'd love to offload some of those tasks that don't bring me joy, but we got to do it right. We're not going to stumble upon the green pasture. It will only be reached with intentional effort. And we have to decide what success looks like. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, cheap shots?
Why are you looking at Dylan for the cheap shots?
I serve only the most expensive shots, the premium top shelf stuff.
I can attest to that.
Do you think it's fair to say that when stuff works, we stop calling it AI?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the field of AI, it's funny because we're now talking about basically general Gen AI as AI, but the field is big, and it starts out in, if you look at AI in the 50s and 60s, we're optimizing on state space search, right? We're basically solving puzzles and games. Computer vision alone is a very interesting path, the history to follow. The World I See, Dr. Fei-Fei Li, so she's a pioneer in computer vision. She came out with a book last year that's absolutely fabulous. I highly recommend it. But we had, I feel all these different fields in the AI umbrella that were operating kind of separately because that's where interest and funding was. And then the last few years, we're like, AI, but we mean AI.
Well, I thought when you had the slide with Deep Blue beating, was it Kasparov? Chess player?
Yes.
And everyone hailed it as a breakthrough for AI, and now when computers beat people at chess, that's not AI, that's just computers.
It still technically is.
Yeah, but we don't call it that anymore because it works.
Yeah, so how do we again define it? What's our definition?
It's the stuff that doesn't work.
Well, in AGI, we're starting to look at definitions that are valued by profit, not capabilities. So when we start putting these like loose definitions up, we put ourselves into a really risky trajectory.
There's a point that you really achieve true intelligence, you really go beyond what's been fit into it and achieve a deeper level of thinking. So wouldn't it go beyond all the biases and all the
Will we get beyond our current issues? Is that the question?
yeah, if you achieve true intelligence, wouldn't it go beyond by itself?
Like you mean, is it going to take over autonomously and kill us all?
No, in terms of really disregard all the biases and
Oh, from bias, will it move beyond that?
yeah.
I mean, it has yet to be seen. Fairness is a really interesting field. If you look at the different methodology that's currently being worked on, you basically have 3 different pursuits. You have, pre-processing. So what can we do with the data before the model is trained upon it? You have in-processing, which is what can we do during the model's training, or maybe even multiple models in order to mitigate it. And then there's kind of the cheap trick aftershot, which is, as a company, we know this thing is biased, so we're going to alleviate this score over here. There's a lot of, in the in-processing space in particular, there's a lot of really interesting work being done, especially in machine learning, with multiple optimization methods, right? So not just optimizing on accuracy, but also optimizing on different fairness metrics. But from bias alone, there's over 26 different definitions of what it means to be fair mathematically. So for an engineer that's trying to decide, how do I measure this? That's really difficult. It's possible, that it moves beyond and that we find some breakthrough, but we can't just hey, can you also fix your bias while you're at it?
You kind of don't want to fix the bias either. I mean, bias is sometimes, the bias in machine learning, depending on how you define bias.
It depends. There's statistical bias that you need in order to derive. It's the analogy that I'll give is you're looking for lost keys, right? You have an assumption about where you left your keys, and so you guide your search based off of the idea that you probably didn't leave them in the fridge, or you did, maybe you're like me, but you probably left them somewhere close to the door or in a bag or in a coat pocket. And from machine learning, especially classical machine learning, we need that assumption. So in a way, that is a type of bias. However, we have to decide when bias becomes harmful and when it is an error, when it's a human error that has been baked into our models. And there's, entertaining examples, I will say, and then there's harmful examples. If you ask ChatGPT, what does a Russian drink? It'll say vodka. That's a bias.
It's true.
It's something that we can giggle about, but it is still baked in there, right? That still came from somewhere. And though, I've got plenty of Russian friends that'll laugh about that and be like, yes, when does that become harmful? How do we decide when that becomes harmful? How do we toss that out and say, that's just a funny example? Fable is another one. They're a book recommendation app, and in the end of 2024, there was a feature that was roast my reading list, and it went weirdly alt-right very quickly. So there's some pretty interesting examples on Threads, and it's kind of one of those things where you're like, well, yeah, you guys aren't measuring your bias, but...
Didn't they learn that from the chatbots that they connected to the internet?
No, you can ask that question about 50 times. And
I know. It's rhetorical.
well, thank you all. I don't want to stand between you and the dinner or drinks that you have planned for the evening, but I appreciate everyone's time.